The night Brielle Mercer walked into the Blackwood estate as a catering employee, she had no idea she was stepping into the most dangerous room on the East Coast. She had spent her entire life trying to disappear. What she never expected was that the most feared man in New York would look straight at her and refuse to let her vanish. And before midnight, they would both be running through fire with an army of killers behind them and a traitor already waiting inside. If you've ever been told you take up too much space, stay until the very end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Tets. The rain had been falling for 3 hours by the time the catering van turned off Route 206 and disappeared into the pine dark corridor of the private road leading to Blackwood Estate. Brielle Mercer sat jammed between a rack of silver serving trays and a plastic cooler that smelled faintly of shrimp cocktail, her back aching, her black uniform already creased from the hour-long drive north from Newark. She was staring at nothing. That was a skill she had perfected, the art of occupying a space without claiming it, of being present in a room without being seen, of folding herself small enough that the world forgot to push back. She was 28 years old and had spent most of those years trying to master that particular disappearing act. The van slowed as it approached the first security checkpoint. Beyond the reinforced iron gate, 2 men in dark tactical gear swept a handheld scanner beneath the undercarriage, while another reviewed the vehicle manifest on a tablet. No smile, no greeting, just efficiency and the flat, evaluating stare of men paid not to trust anything they couldn't verify. One of the other catering staff, a young guy named Trevor, who talked too much and laughed at things that weren't funny, leaned toward the window to look. "That's insane," he whispered. "This is a party?" Brielle didn't answer. She counted the cameras mounted above the gate. 4 visible ones. Probably 3 she couldn't see. She noticed the second vehicle lane was sealed with retractable concrete barriers. She noticed the guards wore earpieces connected to shoulder mounts, not cheap consumer radio units. She noticed that the man checking the manifest wore a different colored lanyard than the 2 scanning the vehicle, and that he carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who did not answer to anyone at this checkpoint. She filed all of it away without knowing why. The van was waved through. The private road wound for nearly a quarter mile through old-growth pine before the estate materialized through the trees. And even then, Brielle's first impression was not awe. It was something closer to dread. The Blackwood estate was not a home. It was a monument to the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because it had already outlasted every argument about whether it was deserved. 4 stories of hand-cut stone and reclaimed European timber rose against the November sky. Every window glowed amber. The circular motor court out front accommodated 12 vehicles and currently held at least 30, including 4 armored SUVs parked in a deliberate defensive pattern near the main entrance and a pair of gunmetal Italian supercars that probably cost more combined than Brielle would earn in the next decade. Handcrafted wrought iron torches lined the approach. Not for ambiance. The flame heads were too high, too steady, too precisely positioned to serve any purpose other than illuminating the faces of everyone who entered. Brielle climbed out of the van and breathed cold air and wet pine and something beneath both of those, something metallic and faint, like the air before a thunderstorm. She had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned to read a room before you walked into it, where you cataloged exits automatically and kept your shoulders angled toward the door out of habit rather than paranoia. That instinct had gotten her called anxious by therapists and weird by former boyfriends, and overly sensitive by a mother who had meant it as a complaint. Tonight it felt less like anxiety, and more like something her body already understood. The service entrance was around the east side of the building. They were met there by a house manager named Pierce, impeccable gray suit, clipped speech, a face that communicated in clear, bloodless terms that he had exactly 0 patience for errors. He gave them their assignments in under 90 seconds. Brielle was stationed in the main ballroom. Silver trays. Champagne rotation. Don't speak unless spoken to, and if spoken to, keep it brief and professional. Don't make eye contact with the principal guests. Don't linger. She had done this 100 times. She knew the choreography. The ballroom was already populated when she entered, a string quartet positioned in the northeast corner playing something classical and elegant that nobody was listening to. The guest list that evening represented a specific taxonomy of power, the kind of power that operated in the space between what laws said and what laws could actually prove. There were politicians with careful smiles and lawyers with reptilian patience, and 3 women who had achieved the specific caliber of beauty that functions as its own form of currency. There were men in their late 50s with the shoulders of athletes and the eyes of people who had made decisions they didn't regret. There were younger men who looked at the older ones the way jackals study lions, waiting, not challenging. And then there was the room's gravity. Even before Brielle located the source of it, she felt it. The way certain conversations shifted in pitch. The way bodies unconsciously angled themselves toward a particular corner of the room. The way the security personnel, already hypervigilant, became slightly more rigid in the presence of a specific cluster of guests near the east window. She looked. He was not the tallest man in the room, not the loudest, not performing for anyone. He stood in a loose group of 4 men holding a glass he hadn't touched, listening with the focused patience of someone who had learned that information was worth more than any response to it. The charcoal suit was impeccable without being aggressive. The jaw was set. The eyes, even at 40 feet, were pale and clear and utterly still. The eyes of someone who had looked at enough dangerous things that nothing shocked him anymore. Damien Vescari. She knew the name the same way she knew the names of weather patterns and natural disasters, not from personal exposure, but from the understanding that certain forces shaped the world you lived in, whether you encountered them directly or not. He was 41 years old and controlled a legitimate business portfolio that included 3 shipping companies, 2 casino resort properties, a private port operation in Baltimore, and a security consulting firm with government contracts she would never see the details of. He was also, by every informed account that existed outside of official records, the architect of the most sophisticated criminal infrastructure on the eastern seaboard. Politicians denied knowing him. Federal investigators had opened and closed files on him 4 times in 8 years. The one journalist who had published a serious investigative piece about his operations had subsequently recanted every claim and moved to Portugal. He had never been charged with anything. He looked like a man who had never been charged with anything. Brielle completed her first champagne rotation without incident, and then her second, and then she ran a tray of crab bruschetta to a cluster of guests near the fireplace who ignored her entirely and talked over her as she offered the food. Their conversation a careful blur of tax code language and resort development, and a name that appeared twice, the senator, spoken with the particular familiarity of people who owned one. She didn't flinch. She never flinched anymore. The flinching had been burned out of her over years of service work, over years of being looked through by people who believed that the person holding the tray was a prop in their evening rather than a human who had driven an hour in a cramped van and whose lower back was already singing a specific song of misery. What she did, instead of flinching, was breathe carefully through the tightness in her chest and keep her expression neutral and remind herself that she needed this paycheck and that Trevor the talker and the 3 other staff members needed theirs, and that the house manager Pierce was watching from the corridor and would notice immediately if she stepped wrong. By 9:15 she needed a minute. Not 5 minutes, not a breakdown. Just 60 seconds without someone looking at her like she was furniture. The library was off of the main hallway, east of the ballroom, and she had clocked it on the walk-in. Heavy oak door, slightly ajar, warm amber light beyond it. Pierce hadn't mentioned it in the briefing, which meant it wasn't a guest area for the evening, which meant it was technically empty. She slipped inside and pulled the door mostly closed behind her and let out one long, controlled breath. The room was enormous and smelled of old leather and wood smoke and a specific quality of paper that only existed in rooms that took books seriously. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, each filled with volumes that looked read rather than decorative. A fireplace occupied the far wall, already burning, throwing warm light across a pair of deep leather chairs and a reading table scattered with documents. The windows behind the shelves were stained glass, and the rain tapping against them made a sound like someone practicing patience. Brielle stood with her back to the door and closed her eyes. 1 minute, that was all. She was 30 seconds into it when the voice came from the shadows beside the fireplace. You breathe like someone who's been holding it in all night. Every muscle in her body went rigid. She opened her eyes. He was already looking at her. He had probably been there the whole time, seated in one of the leather chairs with a folder of documents open across his knee, positioned just far enough from the main light source that the shadows had swallowed him. Standing now, straightening without hurry, he was exactly what she had observed from across the ballroom. Controlled, contained, the kind of still that wasn't relaxed but rather the opposite of relaxed, a stillness that came from discipline rather than ease. "I'm sorry," Brielle said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I thought the room was empty." It wasn't. He didn't say it unkindly. He just said it the way someone stated a fact, without decoration, without social cushioning. The folder in his hand closed. He set it on the chair arm without looking at it. "I'll go," she said. "You don't have to." She hesitated. The room had one exit, and he was between her and the fireplace, but not between her and the door, and she ran that geometry automatically, the same way she always did in unfamiliar rooms with unfamiliar men. "I'm on shift," she said. "You've been on shift for 3 hours, and you haven't stopped moving until right now." He said it without accusation. "You can stand still for a minute." She didn't know what to do with that, so she stood still for a minute. He didn't fill the silence with anything. That was unusual. Most men, in her experience, filled silences with themselves, their opinions, their observations, their automatic assumption that the room needed their voice to function. He simply stood with one hand resting on the chair back and watched her with those pale, clear eyes, and waited. "Your name," he said finally. "Brielle." "Damien." She nodded. She didn't say she already knew. It felt like the wrong thing to say. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Catering? 3 years, part-time." She paused. "I work days at a logistics company. Data entry." "You hate it." "I didn't say that." "You said it when I asked the question." He tilted his head slightly. Your shoulders dropped. She looked at him more carefully. Not because she wanted to, because she couldn't help it. There was something unsettling about being seen with that level of precision by someone she had been trying not to look directly at. "You look at exits," he said. "Excuse me? Every room you enter, you look at exits first. You did it when you came in here." He wasn't accusing her of anything. He was simply describing what he'd observed, the way a naturalist might describe the behavior of an animal. "Most people don't do that. Most people weren't raised in my neighborhood." Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly. Acknowledgement. "Where?" "Newark. South Side." She lifted her chin slightly. A reflex. She'd learned to brace for the look, the one that recalculated her worth downward upon receiving that information. He didn't give her that look. "Smart neighborhood," he said simply. "If you paid attention." She almost smiled. Almost. "I paid attention," she said. The conversation might have continued. She wasn't sure where it would have gone, and she wasn't sure she would have trusted wherever it went, but it was, in some quiet and unexpected way, the most honest exchange she'd had in longer than she wanted to calculate. Then the library door exploded open. The man who staggered through it wore the same dark tactical gear as the security personnel she'd observed at the gate, but the tactical gear was now torn across the left shoulder and soaked dark red from a wound she couldn't fully see. He had one hand braced against the doorframe and the other pressed to his side, and he was breathing in the short, mechanical way that people breathed when breathing itself was taking effort. His eyes found Damien immediately. "Boss." The word came out ragged. "Castellano. They're inside the perimeter. They turned half the floor team." A breath. "Heavy armament. They came to erase the whole event." Damien's transformation was instantaneous and total. Whatever had been present in him during the conversation, the stillness, the attentiveness, the particular quality of his focus on her, compressed into something else entirely. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. His eyes went flat and calculating, and she watched him run a threat assessment in real time, cycling through options she could not see, arriving at conclusions she could not follow. "How many?" he said. "Minimum 16 that I've confirmed, probably more staged outside." "Communications?" "Jammed. Started 90 seconds ago." Damien's jaw tightened once. "Evacuation?" "They've got the east corridor. Front motor court is a kill zone." The security man's legs were losing their reliability. He was going to go down. "I came straight to you." The first burst of automatic fire came through the ballroom walls like something tearing the fabric of the night. It lasted 4 seconds, and then the screaming started. Not the dramatic screaming of films, but the raw, involuntary sound of humans whose nervous systems had processed sudden mortal danger and had not yet caught up to their own voices. The string quartet stopped. Something large shattered. Something larger collapsed. Brielle's body reacted before her mind did. She pressed herself back against the shelf behind her, one hand finding a thick book spine and gripping it the way you grip something when the floor becomes unreliable. Her heart was hammering. Her throat had closed to a narrow tube. But she was breathing. She was tracking. She was not gone. The security man went to one knee. Damien crossed to him in 3 strides, caught him before he hit the floor, lowered him controlled and deliberate. He looked at the wound once, pressed the man's own hand firmly against it, and said something quiet that Brielle couldn't hear. Then he stood and turned, and his eyes found hers. "With me," he said. "My coworkers are running right now." He moved toward her with purpose. "The ones who aren't already gone from the building won't be helped by you dying in this room." "I don't—" "Brielle." Her name in his mouth had weight. Not demanding, certain. "I know this building. They don't have the west side yet. We have maybe 90 seconds. She was terrified. That was real, and she didn't try to pretend it wasn't. But terror, she had learned in South Newark at the age of 12, was a resource if you didn't let it make your decisions for you. She stepped away from the shelves. She nodded once. He moved to the far wall, the fireplace wall, and pressed his hands against the stone surround in a specific sequence that looked practiced. A mechanism clicked. A seam appeared in the stone to the left of the fireplace. A hidden passage, narrow and dark, smelling of cold concrete and age. He was already pulling it open when the western wing of the mansion detonated. The blast was not a movie explosion, not a clean ball of orange fire and a neat shockwave. It was a pressure wave and a sound that went below sound and a sudden catastrophic rearrangement of the room's geometry. The windows blew inward. The bookshelves nearest the exterior wall went sideways, thousands of volumes becoming debris in a fraction of a second. The fireplace surround cracked down the center. The overhead light fixture swung violently and went dark, and the only illumination was the orange hell coming through the shattered windows from outside. Brielle was airborne for a moment she couldn't account for. Then she was on the floor, and something heavy was across her left leg, and the air had a texture, dense and hot and wrong, and she understood in a very specific and concrete way that she was in serious trouble. She tried to push herself up. The weight on her leg was immovable. She tried again. The pain that answered was the kind of pain that didn't allow for argument. She could hear fire. She could feel it, not just as heat, but as sound. A constant low roar beneath the screaming and the distant continued crack of gunfire from somewhere in the body of the house. "Damien." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Smoke was starting to move across the floor, thick and purposeful. "Damien." A silhouette came through the orange and the dark. Not rushing, moving with the specific controlled purpose of someone who had trained for rooms like this. His forehead was bleeding from a cut above the left eyebrow, a dark rivulet running across his cheek, and his jacket was gone, and somewhere in his right hand was a combat pistol he hadn't had before the blast. He crossed the burning library toward her with the same deliberate certainty he'd used when he poured a glass of wine he didn't intend to drink, like the collapsing ceiling around him was a minor inconvenience rather than a death sentence. He looked at her leg. He looked at the beam across it. "Can you move?" he said. "No, it's—" He handed off the pistol to his left hand, grabbed the beam with his right, and moved it. Not slowly, not with visible effort, just removed it the way you remove a chair from a table, with the clean economy of someone who had decided the thing was going to move. She understood that the weight of it had probably been extraordinary, and that he was running on something other than physics right now. But the result was that her leg was free, and the pain where it had been was extraordinary and immediate. "Stand up," he said. She tried. The ankle took her weight for approximately half a second before something wrong happened in it. A grinding, sickening wrong. And she went down hard onto her knee and made a sound she was embarrassed by. Damien was already beside her, kneeling, looking at the ankle with clinical focus. "Fractured," he said. Not a question. You can't walk on it, I know." He stood. The room was filling with smoke faster now, the fire having found the shelves and the leather chairs and the decades of paper and moving through them with vicious appetite. The hidden passage was still open, but it was 20 feet away and she couldn't cover 20 feet. "I'm going to carry you." The refusal came out of her before she had a chance to evaluate it. "No." The word was automatic, from a place so deep it bypassed thought. You can't. Brielle, you can't carry me. Her voice cracked on it. The smoke was making her eyes run, and she didn't want him to think she was crying. But she was also not crying, and the distinction didn't matter because what was happening underneath the words was 28 years of being told, directly, indirectly, through laughter, and through silence, and through the eyes of people who looked at her body like an inconvenience, that she was too much, too heavy, too large, too much space, too much weight, too much. You won't make it. I'll slow you down. Go. Please, Damien, just... He knelt down in front of her, not to be at her level, not as a gesture. He knelt down because he needed her to see his face when he said the next thing. Enough. One word. The fire roared. The ceiling groaned. Something in the east wing of the house collapsed with a sound like a building clearing its throat. He put one arm beneath her knees and one arm behind her back, and he stood. He stood like it was nothing, like she was nothing, not in the diminishing sense, but in the sense of weight being an irrelevant variable in a calculation that had already been made. Her body against his chest, his heartbeat, which was elevated but controlled, his breathing, which was steady. She felt it, the steadiness of him, and she did not understand how it was possible in the middle of what was happening, and she didn't trust it, and she also couldn't look away from it. She started. Stop, he said. He was already moving toward the passage. Every time you tell me what I can't do, we lose 3 seconds. I'm serious, I weigh, Brielle. He stepped through the passage entrance without slowing. I decide what I can carry. The words went through her like something she had been waiting a long time to hear and had stopped expecting. The passage was dark and narrow and sloped downward at a grade that was gentle but steady. Concrete walls close enough on either side that his shoulders nearly brushed both. And he moved through it without hesitation because he knew it, had probably walked it 100 times, and she could feel in his body the precise confidence of someone navigating familiar terrain in the dark. Behind them, the stone door mechanism engaged and closed, and the roar of the fire became muffled and then distant and then almost abstract. She became aware of the sound of her own breathing, of his, of the way her body, which she had spent years trying to make as small and inconspicuous and apologetic as possible, was being held without apology or effort or complaint. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder because there was nowhere else to put it, and because she was exhausted and terrified, and because the alternative was to keep looking at his face in the dark, and she wasn't ready for whatever that was going to mean. Who are the Castellanos? She said. A family that made a decision. His voice was even. Tonight they decided to start a war. By attacking a charity gala? By attacking everyone who would attend one. He turned a corner in the passage. Dim emergency lighting appeared. Amber, industrial, barely sufficient. Enough. They weren't after the guests, they were after the structure. The relationships in that room. Kill the right 4 or 5 people and you collapse a network that took 15 years to build. And you're the network. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Were you the target, specifically? A pause. Yes. She absorbed that. And you walked into a room where you were the target. I walk into those rooms every day. He said it without drama, like it was a weather report. Tonight was supposed to be different. I had information that suggested the event was clean. Someone gave you bad information. Someone gave me deliberate misinformation. His voice dropped slightly on the last word. Not anger. Something colder than anger. Someone inside. The passage opened up into a larger space, a wider corridor, concrete, with heavy conduit running along the ceiling and doors at intervals that might have been storage or might have been something else entirely. At the far end, a steel blast door, industrial weight, with an electronic keypad and what appeared to be a biometric scanner. Damien carried her to the keypad one-handed, entered a code she didn't try to see. The biometric scanner read his palm. The door's lock disengaged with a sequence of heavy mechanical sounds. Not one bolt, but many, releasing in sequence. Cold air poured through as the door opened. Outside was a parking structure, underground, low-ceilinged, lit by fluorescent panels, smelling of oil and concrete and cold. 3 vehicles sat in assigned spots. 2 black SUVs with darkened windows. 1 compact civilian car that looked deliberately unremarkable. He carried her to the first SUV and placed her in the passenger seat, with the same careful certainty with which he'd lifted her, settling her ankle with deliberate gentleness before closing the door. He was in the driver's seat in seconds, the engine turning over, the vehicle moving. She watched through the windshield as the vehicle cleared the structure and emerged onto a service road she didn't recognize. Pine trees on both sides. The distant orange pulse of the estate's fire visible through gaps in the tree line above and behind them. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere safe." Define safe. He glanced at her once, his face in profile, backlit by dashboard light, the cut above his eyebrow still bleeding, jaw set, eyes on the road. "Somewhere they won't look," he said. "And after that?" His hands tightened once on the wheel. "We find out who sold me." The SUV accelerated into the dark. Brielle looked through the rear window at the burning horizon. She had walked into that estate tonight as a woman who had spent her entire life trying to become invisible. She didn't know yet what she was becoming instead, but the man beside her drove through the dark like someone who already knew the answer and was waiting for her to catch up. Ahead of them, hidden in the industrial underbelly of a city that didn't ask too many questions, someone was already waiting. Someone who had been waiting all night. Someone Damien Viscari called his oldest friend. The underground facility didn't look like salvation. It looked like the inside of something that had been built to survive the end of the world, and didn't particularly care whether you found it comfortable. Damien drove the armored SUV through the warehouse's concealed entrance without slowing, the vehicle's headlights cutting across bare concrete walls as the road descended at a steep grade beneath the building's foundations. The steel doors had already begun closing behind them before they were fully inside, hydraulic mechanisms engaging with the heavy, indifferent certainty of a trap closing, though whether it was closing around them or around everyone else was a question Brielle hadn't resolved yet. She had stopped trying to catalog the pain in her ankle. It was still there, still sending its insistent signal up through her nervous system, but she'd found a place slightly behind the pain where she could observe it without being consumed by it. That particular survival skill, dissociating just enough from physical discomfort to keep functioning, was another thing South Newark had given her that she'd never thanked it for. The vehicle stopped. Damien cut the engine. For 3 seconds he sat without moving, both hands still on the wheel, and she watched him in profile doing something internal. Not praying, not calculating, something more fundamental than either. Processing, deciding what version of himself was required for whatever came next. Then he got out. He came around to her side and opened the door, and she had already decided she was going to attempt standing on her own, a decision her ankle immediately overruled. He caught her before she hit the door frame, one arm across her back, and she hated the reflex that made her start to apologize, and hated more that she caught herself doing it and swallowed it back down. "Don't," he said, without her having said anything. "I wasn't going to." He looked at her. "You were thinking it." She didn't answer. The facility that opened up around them as they moved through the first interior door was not what she had constructed in her mind during the drive. She had been picturing something military, Spartan, utilitarian, smelling of gun oil and old coffee. What she found instead was a fully operational trauma facility buried 40 feet beneath the streets of Brooklyn, clean and bright and precise, with the particular organized intensity of a place that had been designed for crisis and had experienced enough of it that crisis was simply the baseline condition. There were at least a dozen people visible from the corridor, medical personnel in scrubs moving between rooms, a tactical medic applying a pressure dressing to a man seated against the wall with the stoic expression of someone in significant pain who had decided not to give it the satisfaction of his attention. 2 men in dark civilian clothes were hunched over a communications array at a folding table, headsets on, voices low and rapid. Through an open doorway, she saw what appeared to be a surgical suite, sterile white, already occupied. Nobody looked surprised to see Damien. Nobody looked relieved either. They looked the way people looked when the situation they'd been preparing for had arrived, and there was too much work to do for feelings to be relevant yet. A woman in scrubs, 40s, short-haired, moving with the compressed efficiency of someone who had learned never to waste a step, came toward them immediately. "How bad?" she said, looking at Brielle. "Ankle, probable fracture, concussion, smoke inhalation." Damien's inventory was clinical and accurate. "Complete workup. Room 3. The woman was already gesturing to a second medic. I want her scanned, Damien said. I heard you the first time. I want the orthopedic consult before you splint anything. The woman stopped and looked at him with an expression that communicated clearly and without hostility that she had been doing this since before he had opinions about it. Damien, room 3. He looked at Brielle. Something moved across his face. Not uncertainty, which she suspected was not an emotion he experienced in any conventional sense, but something adjacent to it. The specific discomfort of a man who controlled everything within his reach, confronting the boundary of his reach. I'll be right outside, he said. She nodded. The examination was thorough and efficient, and hurt in several specific places that she had been managing to ignore until the examination made ignoring them impossible. The ankle was fractured, a clean break through the lateral malleolus, the doctor told her, which would heal well with proper immobilization. The concussion was mild but real. The smoke inhalation had left her airways raw and irritated, but her oxygen saturation was acceptable. She was treated, splinted, given medication that she took without asking what it was, because she was tired enough that trust felt like the simpler option. She was given a clean set of clothes, plain, dark, practical, by a woman who didn't explain where they came from and didn't ask for gratitude. She changed slowly, alone in the room, and tried not to think too carefully about the fact that she was doing all of this in an underground facility in Brooklyn at 3 in the morning because she had needed 60 seconds alone in a library. 60 seconds. That was all it had been. Damien was in the corridor when she was done, exactly where he'd said he'd be, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and the cut above his eyebrow now cleaned and closed with a small adhesive strip that looked like it had been applied by someone else, because he clearly hadn't bothered looking in a mirror first. He had acquired a different shirt somewhere, dark gray, no tie. He looked tired in this way people look tired when they had been running on controlled adrenaline for hours, and the adrenaline was beginning to present its bill. Sit down, she said. He looked at her. You're still bleeding a little, she said. Above the strip. Sit down. A pause. Then he sat in the chair outside the room. Not gracefully, not with his usual managed ease, but with the particular heaviness of a man whose body had been arguing with him for a while and had finally been permitted to make its point. She stood in front of him and adjusted the adhesive strip with her fingers, pressing the edges flat with more care than was probably necessary, and she was aware of how strange this was. The two of them, 6 hours after being strangers in a burning library, existing in this precise and quiet proximity. And she decided not to make it strange by narrating it. Thank you, he said. For what? For not asking me questions in the car. She looked at him. I had questions. I know. I just figured the questions could wait until you weren't driving 100 miles an hour through the dark. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The idea of one. Who is Victor Kane? She said. The almost smile disappeared. His eyes, which had been slightly unfocused in the way of exhausted people allowing themselves a moment of non-vigilance, sharpened back to full attention so quickly it was almost visible as a physical event. Where did you hear that name? One of the medics. When we came in. She said something to the man at the communications table. She said, "Does Kane know yet?" And the way she said it, Brielle paused. The way she said it wasn't like she was talking about someone who was going to help. Damien was quiet for a long moment. Victor Kane has been my second in command for 14 years, he said. Has been, she noted. His jaw tightened once. Has been. You think he's involved? I think someone inside my organization gave the Castellanos the security rotation, the layout of the estate, and the private communications channel that was supposed to be unjammable. He said it evenly, but the evenness had a quality to it now. The quality of something being held at a specific controlled pressure. The number of people with access to all three of those things simultaneously is very small. How small? 3. He paused. One of them is dead. One of them is in this building. The third... He stopped. The third is you. The air in the corridor went flat. Brielle looked at him and did not look away. I've been a caterer for 3 years. Before that, I did data entry. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment in Kearney. I don't own a car. I have exactly $2,014 in my savings account. Her voice was steady. I didn't know you existed before tonight, except as a name people said quietly. He watched her through all of this. I know, he said. Then why? Because I needed you to say it. He stood slowly. Because I need to know how you talk when you're frightened and accused of something you didn't do. And now I know. He moved past her toward the corridor. Come with me. There's something you need to see. She followed him on her crutches. The medic had produced them with the same wordless efficiency that characterized everything in this place. Through 2 more security doors, each requiring a different credential, each opening onto a corridor that felt progressively less like a facility and more like the interior of something much older. The walls changed from poured concrete to reinforced bedrock, bare stone with utility conduit bolted along the ceiling, and the air became cooler and faintly damp. The final door was unlike any of the others. It was circular, perhaps 8 feet in diameter. The frame was solid steel, several inches thick, set flush into the bedrock with the kind of engineering that suggested it had been designed not just to keep people out, but to survive the kind of events that made locks irrelevant. The lock mechanism was multiple: biometric, numeric, and a physical key that Damien retrieved from a cord around his neck, all 3 in sequence. The door opened inward with a sound like a held breath releasing. The chamber beyond it was large enough to hold a subway car and currently held considerably more than that. The far wall was floor-to-ceiling server racks, cooling fans humming, indicator lights blinking in irregular patterns she couldn't decode. To the left, climate-controlled archival storage, rows of sealed cases on industrial shelving, each labeled in a code she couldn't read. To the right, reinforced metal shelving, holding pallets of something she didn't immediately identify until she was closer, and the lighting resolved and she understood she was looking at bullion. Gold bars, individually wrapped, stacked with the organized practicality of someone who treated them as inventory rather than treasure. In the center of the room, bolted to a granite platform, a single workstation with 6 monitors, all currently dark. Brielle stood at the entrance and looked at all of it and felt the specific vertigo of someone who has stepped through a door that represents an irreversible increase in the stakes of their situation. The estate was the surface, Damien said. He moved to the workstation and entered a code. The monitors came alive. The art, the marble, the chandelier, the guests who came to be seen attending my events. The mansion was a performance. He gestured at the chamber around them. This is the substance. What's in the cases? Evidence, he said. 14 years of documentation. Financial records, communications, transfer records, evidence of corruption at every level of the city's power structure, law enforcement, judicial, municipal, federal contractor networks. A pause. Evidence that could end careers, indict organizations, collapse institutions. And you're keeping it here instead of giving it to who? He turned to look at her. The people I have evidence on are the people I would give evidence to. He said it without bitterness, as a statement of arithmetic. This is the only safe place for it. She looked at the servers. Are you going to use it? I've been using pieces of it for years. That's how this works. He turned back to the monitors. Balance, not exposure. You release too much at once. The system reacts to protect itself. The evidence disappears, and so do you. You apply precise, targeted pressure. He pulled up a map on the central monitor, a network diagram, nodes and connections, some highlighted red. And you maintain leverage. She studied the map without being able to read it fully. This is what they wanted. Yes, not you. This. His silence confirmed it. The Castellanos don't care about revenge, she said slowly. They wanted this room. They wanted this room and everything in it, and they wanted me dead before I could use any of it. He closed the map. Which means someone told them exactly what was down here and exactly what it was worth. Kane. Damien didn't answer. You brought me here, she said. To this room. You showed me all of this. Yes. Why? He turned from the monitors and looked at her with the unmodified directness that she had been adjusting to all night. The complete absence of social performance, the refusal to look anywhere except exactly where he meant to look. Because you tried to make me leave you in a burning building, he said. Twice. He crossed his arms. My captains have never done that. My associates have never done that. In 14 years, not one person who understood who I was and what I controlled has ever once prioritized my survival over their own access to what I could give them. He held her gaze. You tried to send me away without asking for anything. I wasn't trying to be noble, she said. I was trying to be practical. You could move faster without me. That's what you told yourself. That's what's true. It might be both. He turned back to the monitors. Either way, you're here now. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything, and they existed for a moment in the hum of the servers and the cool recycled air of a room built to outlast catastrophe. Then the alarm went off. It wasn't a siren. It was a low pulsing tone, deep enough to feel in the chest, coming from speakers embedded in the ceiling throughout the chamber. The monitors shifted automatically, pulling up security feeds, corridor cameras, exterior cameras, the approaches to the warehouse above them. Red warnings pulsed at the edges of the screens. Damien was at the workstation in 2 strides. She watched him read the feeds the way a fluent reader read text. Not sequentially, but holistically, the whole pattern at once. His hand stilled on the keyboard. That's not possible, he said quietly. Not to her. To something he was seeing on the screen that didn't fit. She moved closer. The central monitor showed a corridor she recognized, the one outside the trauma facility, the one where she'd adjusted the strip above his eyebrow an hour ago. The timestamp in the corner was current. The corridor was empty on the feed. What am I looking at? She said. The corridor outside medical. He pulled up a second feed, then a third. His voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard from him before. Not cold, not controlled. Careful. The carefulness of a man who had just found evidence of something he had hoped was wrong about and now understood was right. These feeds are 12 minutes old. Someone looped them? Someone looped them from inside this network. He brought up a fourth screen. From inside this facility. From a terminal with level 3 clearance. He stepped back from the workstation. His hand dropped to the firearm holstered at his hip. There are 4 people in this building with level 3 clearance. She counted without asking. Himself. Her. Which was clearly not possible in any real sense. The 2 others she didn't know. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the vault door. Not the quick, purposeful footsteps of medical staff. Heavier. More deliberate. More than one set, moving in the coordinated rhythm of people who had agreed on exactly where they were going before they started moving. Damien moved her behind him with one arm and raised the pistol with the other, positioning himself in the center of the chamber's entrance with the door between them and the corridor still partially open. The footsteps stopped just outside. A voice came through the gap. You can put it down, Damien. Unhurried, almost warm. The voice of a man arriving somewhere he had been heading for a long time. I've got the corridor on lockdown. Both exits from the medical wing are sealed. Your remaining security is managing casualties upstairs. They'll be busy for a while. Damien's breathing didn't change. Nothing about him changed except his eyes, and what changed in them was something she could only partially read. A specific, deep, structural damage that came from a source she understood without being told. This was a voice he recognized. Victor, he said. The man who stepped through the vault door was perhaps 50. Compact build, gray at the temples, wearing a dark civilian jacket over what appeared to be body armor. He carried a suppressed submachine gun in a 2-handed grip, and he moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had been in enough rooms like this to have stopped being impressed by them. He was not alone. 2 men followed him through, taking flanking positions inside the door, weapons up. Victor Kane looked at Damien the way a person looked at something they had once valued and had gotten past valuing. I told them you'd survive the fire, he said. I told them you were too stubborn. He glanced around the chamber, the servers, the archives, the pallets of gold, with an expression of cold satisfaction. I was right, as it turned out, which is fine. This way I get to watch you understand it while it's happening. How long? Damien said. Officially, 3 months. Victor moved slowly to his right, keeping the weapon level, increasing the angle. Realistically? 3 years. That's how long I've been watching you make decisions I disagreed with and being told, directly and indirectly, that my opinion wasn't what was being requested. He stopped moving. You stopped trusting me, Damien. You just didn't tell me. You kept me in the position while you quietly moved the access around me. His voice stayed conversational. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? I noticed a pattern, Damien said. I adjusted for it. I didn't know who yet. And you still don't trust your own instincts. That was always the problem. Victor tilted his head. His eyes moved to Brielle with an expression of flat, incurious assessment. And the waitress? You brought her here. Something shifted in his face, not amusement, the simulation of it. 14 years. All the people I've seen you refuse to trust. And a catering employee from Newark gets inside this room in the first 8 hours. Lower the weapon, Victor. I will, when I'm done. He looked back at Damien. The Castellanos get the shipping network and half the port operations. I get the archives and the leverage they represent. The gold gets divided. He said it with the brisk tone of someone presenting a business summary that had already been approved. You get a clean death, which is more than you'd have gotten if Marco had gotten to you at the estate. So in some sense, I've already done you a courtesy. The silence that followed was dense. Brielle stood 2 feet behind Damien's right shoulder, and she was running her own calculations, the kind she ran in rooms where something bad was arriving, and she had to decide whether she was going to participate in what happened next or simply absorb it. She was on crutches. Her ankle was splinted. She had no weapon and no training, and she weighed the specific weight that she had been apologizing for all her life. She looked to her left. The IV stand that had been wheeled into the chamber with her when Damien had moved her here for monitoring. The medical staff had left it against the wall, its bag and line disconnected, the weighted metal base sitting on the concrete floor exactly 4 feet from where she was standing. She looked at Victor's 2 flanking men. The one on the left was watching Damien. The one on the right was watching Victor. Neither of them was watching her. That was their mistake. Not the same mistake that men had made with her all her life. The mistake of thinking she wasn't worth looking at. A different version of it. The tactical version. The version where they had looked at her and made a rapid assessment of threat potential and had assigned her a number close to 0 and had moved their attention to the things they'd decided actually mattered. Victor was still talking. He was explaining something about the shipping contracts, the specific numbers, the transition timeline. The 2 senators who had already been notified and had expressed their quiet endorsement through channels that wouldn't appear in any record. He spoke with the satisfaction of a man delivering a presentation he had been rehearsing for months and had not expected to actually get to give. Damien listened with his weapon lowered and his hands visible, and the specific stillness she had first seen in the library. Not the stillness of someone who had given up, but the stillness of someone measuring the distance between where they were and where they needed to be. Victor stepped closer. One more step. Brielle moved. The crutch went down. She was on one leg. She crossed the 4 feet to the IV stand in 2 lurching steps that cost her an amount of pain. She filed away for later, grabbed the stand with both hands, and swung it the way she'd seen her uncle swing a bat on a sandlot in Newark 30 years ago in a memory she'd never known she'd kept. Not overhead, but sideways, low and fast, the weighted base leading. It connected with the side of Victor Kane's skull with a sound she would hear in her sleep for a long time. He went sideways. The submachine gun fired once, ceiling, harmless. And then he was down and the gun was skidding across the concrete, and the 2 flanking men were reacting, but they were a half-second behind what had already happened, and half a second was enough. Damien was moving before Victor hit the ground. He went to the closer flanking man first, not the one nearest him, but the one nearest her, with a velocity that made the distance between them seem like it hadn't existed. The pistol came up and made contact as a striking weapon, not a firing one, a brutal controlled impact to the jaw that spun the man into the wall. The second man swung his weapon around, but Damien was already past him, one hand controlling the barrel, one knee driving into the man's thigh with enough force to collapse the leg, and then it was over. 4 seconds, maybe 5. The chamber went quiet except for the server fans and the alarm pulse from the ceiling, still running its patient, metronomic warning. Brielle was on the floor. She had gone down when her ankle gave after the swing, and she was sitting with her back against the wall and the IV stand still in her hands and breathing, really breathing, in and out, the involuntary recovery breathing of someone whose body had just done something their mind was still catching up to. Victor was unconscious. One of the flanking men was slumped against the wall. The other was on the floor making sounds that indicated he was alive and would stay that way and would have a significant headache about it. Damien crossed the chamber to her. He lowered himself to one knee on the concrete in front of her. He was bleeding again from the cut. The adhesive strip had come loose during the last 30 seconds. He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for, something that occupied the space between disbelief and a very specific gratitude that had nowhere comfortable to land. "Your ankle," he said. "I know. You tore the splint." "I know." He looked at the IV stand still in her grip. She was still holding it. She became aware of that fact and set it carefully on the floor. "You could have been shot," he said. "You could have been shot," she returned. "That's different." "It really isn't." He looked at her for a long moment, the alarm still pulsing above them, the unconscious body of his oldest friend and his 14-year lieutenant lying 6 feet to their left on the floor of a vault that Victor Kane had sold access to for half an empire. "I need to know something," Damien said. His voice had lost its managed evenness. "Not much. Enough." "Ask. Why?" He held her gaze. "Not the strategy, not the opportunity. You saw the opening and you took it. I understand the mechanics. I'm asking why you chose to." He paused. "You didn't have to be in this room. You didn't have to be in any of this. You could have found a way out of this building hours ago if staying out of it had been your priority." She thought about the question the way she thought about questions that deserved real answers. "Because you carried me through a burning building," she said. "When you didn't have to. When it would have been easier not to." She looked at him directly. "And because the whole time you were carrying me, you never once made me feel like a weight." The alarm kept pulsing. Victor Kane was bound before he regained consciousness, his wrist secured with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had handled the logistics of this kind of situation many times. The two flanking men were secured separately. Damien made 3 quick calls on a hardline terminal that bypassed whatever Victor's people had done to the communications. His voice low, specific, the calls brief to the point of terseness. People were coming. The situation above them, whatever was still unresolved in the facility above, was being managed. He came back to where Betrayal sat against the wall, her ankle resplinted with materials the medical team had left in the chamber, her hands still faintly trembling in the way hands trembled when the adrenaline finished burning and left only the chemistry of aftermath. He sat down beside her on the concrete floor, not across from her, beside her, back against the same wall, the both of them looking at the same chamber, the servers, the archives, the sealed cases full of evidence that could collapse institutions, Victor Kane's body on the floor, the small catastrophe of a night that had started with champagne and ended here. "What happens now?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Now," he said, "we find out how deep it goes." His phone, the hardline handset from the terminal, buzzed once with an incoming message. He looked at it. Something in his face changed, not the surface. The surface stayed controlled, stayed the version of himself he wore in rooms where he could not afford to be read. But beneath that, in the specific tension of his jaw, and the particular stillness of his eyes, she saw something that she recognized from her own experience. The look of a person receiving confirmation of something they had hoped was wrong and now understood was worse than they had feared. He turned the handset toward her so she could read the message. 4 words on the screen. 4 words from a sender identified only by a numeric code she couldn't decode. 4 words that told her the night was not ending. It was beginning. She read them twice. Then she looked at Damien Viscari, who was already standing, already moving, already making the calculation of what came next with the focused urgency of a man who understood that the window for the next decision was closing faster than the window for any decision that had come before it. And she understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives in moments when there is genuinely no way back, that she was no longer a caterer who had stepped into the wrong room at the wrong party. She was something she didn't have a name for yet. And whatever that was, it was going to be decided in the next. The message on the handset said, "They have your daughter." Brielle read it twice because the first time her brain refused to process it as information and tried to process it instead as an error, a wrong number, a misdelivered communication, something that belonged to a different situation in a different room. The second time she read it, she understood it was none of those things, and she looked up from the screen at Damien Viscari, who was standing with his back to her now, facing the server wall, his hand pressed flat against the metal casing of the nearest rack as though he needed something solid to push against. He wasn't moving. That was the thing that frightened her more than the message. In the 6 hours she had known this man, she had watched him move through a burning building and a gunfight, and the betrayal of his oldest friend with the controlled momentum of something that did not permit itself to stop. He had always been moving, calculating, deciding, acting. The stillness she'd first observed in the library had been a chosen stillness, a deliberate conservation of energy, not an absence of forward motion. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who had just had the floor removed. "Damien," she said. He didn't answer. "Damien." She pushed herself upright, ignoring the ankle, putting weight on it anyway, because this was not a moment that could wait for her to be comfortable. She crossed the chamber toward him, 3 uneven steps, and put her hand on his arm. The muscles beneath her hand were rigid, not tense, rigid, the way things went rigid when they were fighting against themselves. "Tell me," she said. He turned, and what was on his face now was something she had not seen there before, and understood immediately she was not supposed to be seeing. The surface stripped away, the constructed control that he wore the way other men wore expensive watches, all of it gone, and what was underneath was a man who was afraid. Not of the men on the floor behind them, not of the Castellanos or the compromised facility or the collapsed night, afraid of something much more specific and much more total. "Elena," he said. The name came out with a texture she hadn't heard in his voice before. "She's 16. She lives with her mother in—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "She lives outside the city. She's supposed to be outside everything. That's the only condition I've maintained without exception for 16 years. She stays outside everything." "Who knows about her?" "4 people. His eyes moved to Victor Kane, still bound and unconscious on the floor. 3, now that I've adjusted my math. Brielle looked at Kane. "Wake him up," she said. Damien looked at her. "Wake him up," she said again. Right now. We need to know who they called and when and where she is, and he's the only one in this room who has those answers." For a half second she thought he was going to argue, thought he was going to tell her this wasn't her problem, that she should stay back, that this was something he needed to handle in a way that didn't involve her. Instead, he moved past her to where Kane lay against the base of the server rack and crouched down and applied a specific practiced pressure to a point beneath Kane's jaw that brought the man back to consciousness in approximately 4 seconds, gasping and confused, and then, as his eyes found Damien's face 6 inches from his own, very rapidly, not confused at all. "Elena," Damien said. Kane's eyes cleared the rest of the way. He said nothing. "Victor." Damien's voice had gone to a register she had not heard from him. Not cold, not controlled, not the managed temperature of a man who had learned to keep his reactions calibrated. Raw. The register of something that had been pushed past the architecture of discipline entirely. "You have approximately 30 seconds to make a decision about how this conversation goes." "30 seconds to what?" Kane said. His voice was hoarse from the blow to his skull. There was dried blood above his left ear, and his eyes weren't quite tracking at equal speed, but he was present, alert, making calculations of his own. "You're not going to do anything catastrophic to me down here. You need what I know." "That's correct," Damien said. "I need what you know. That's the only reason you're still breathing right now, so I would strongly recommend reframing whatever leverage you think you have." Kane looked at him for a long moment. "She's not hurt," he said finally. Damien's hand, which had been resting on his knee with controlled stillness, closed into a fist. "Where?" "That's not how this works." "Victor, they're not going to hurt her." Kane said it with a firmness that was almost convincing. Almost. "That was never the arrangement. She's insurance, Damien, that's all. She stays safe as long as you cooperate with the transition." "The transition." The word came out of Damien's mouth like something he was tasting and finding poisonous. "You took my daughter to facilitate a business transition. I took her to ensure you didn't do something irreversible with the archives before we had control of them." Kane shifted against his restraints. His voice had taken on the particular measured tone of a man trying to reframe a catastrophic situation as a manageable one, trying to sound like the reasonable party in a room where he was bound on the floor. "This doesn't have to end badly. Give Marco access to the servers. Give him the shipping manifests and the port contracts. Walk away from the East Coast operation and take enough capital to live 3 lifetimes in whatever country you choose. Elena comes home by morning, clean, simple." There's nothing clean about this, Damien said. There could be. You brought a 16-year-old girl into this room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There is no version of this that is clean. Kane held his gaze. Then what are you going to do? Kill me and lose your only lead? No, Damien said. He stood. His voice had gone somewhere past anger, past fear, into a territory she didn't have a good name for. The territory of someone who has passed through the last door that leads back to the person they used to be. I'm going to find her myself. And when I do, you and Marco are going to have a much more limited set of options than you currently believe you have. He turned from Kane and pulled out the hardline handset and made 2 calls in rapid succession, his back to both of them, his voice low enough that she caught fragments only. A location reference, a name she didn't recognize, the phrase full protocol delivered with the flatness of a code phrase rather than a descriptive term. Brielle stood in the center of the chamber and looked at Victor Kane. Kane looked back at her with the evaluating eyes of a man who had spent a career assessing threats and had settled on a number for her. You should leave, he said. Not unkindly, with the specific gentleness of someone who believed they were offering something of value. You have no stake in this. You were in the wrong place. Go to the medical room, tell them you need to rest, and in the morning someone will drive you home, and this will be something that happened to you once. She looked at him for a moment. Where did they take her? She said. Kane blinked. The girl, Brielle said. Elena. Where did they take her? I'm not going to tell you that. Why not? Because you're not relevant to... You just told me she's not hurt and that she's insurance, Brielle said. Which means she's somewhere accessible, somewhere your people can move her quickly if the situation changes, and somewhere that Damien can verify she's alive without too much logistical difficulty, which means she's not far. She watched his face while she said it. And the fact that you just reacted to the word far tells me I'm right. Kane's expression closed. You're not a professional, he said. No, she agreed. I'm not. Then stay out of professional business. I was in a burning building 4 hours ago because I stepped into a library for 60 seconds, she said. I'm a little past the point of staying out of things. Damien came back from the terminal. He looked at her, then at Kane, reading the geometry of the conversation without being told what it had contained. Atlantic Warehouse District, he said. It took her a moment to understand he was telling her what he'd found, where Elena was. Old cold storage facility on the northern pier. Marco's been running a secondary operations site there for 8 months. We have intelligence on it, but we never moved on it because it wasn't connected to anything we needed urgently. His eyes went to Kane. It was waiting for a moment exactly like this one. Kane said nothing. How many people? Damien said. Kane said nothing. Victor. Damien crouched down in front of him again. When he spoke, it was quiet, the quietest he'd been all night, and the quietness of it was the most frightening version of him she'd encountered. I have known you for 14 years. I have trusted you with things I have trusted no other living person with. I have watched you at your worst and backed you when I should have cut you loose and given you every opportunity to tell me when something was wrong. A pause. If you had come to me 3 years ago and told me what you just told me, that you felt sidelined, that you felt the trust was breaking, I would have listened. I would have fixed it. Kane looked at him. Would you? He said. And for the first time, his voice had something in it other than calculation, something that might, in a different room, have been grief. Would you really? The question sat in the air between them. Damien didn't answer it. He stood and turned to Brielle and said, I need you to stay here. No, she said. Brielle, you need someone who isn't on anyone's radar, she said. Your face is known. Every person going with you is known. The Castellanos have had inside access to your organization for months. They know your tactical patterns, your vehicles, your personnel. She held his gaze. They don't know me. That doesn't make you an asset. That makes you a civilian with a fractured ankle. A civilian with a fractured ankle who they will not be looking for, she said. And who can move through the perimeter of a secured location without triggering the same response that your people will. He stared at her. I grew up learning how to not be seen, she said. It came out steadier than she felt. That's not a liability tonight. That's the only thing that matters. The drive to the Atlantic Warehouse District took 18 minutes. which was 18 minutes of Brielle sitting in the back of a second armored vehicle while Damien reviewed floor plans on a tablet in the front seat and spoke in low, rapid exchanges with two men she hadn't met before. Both large, both moving with the efficient economy of people for whom violence was a professional skill rather than an emergency response. Their names, as far as she could determine, were Reeves and a man everyone called Carver, and neither of them looked at her with anything resembling confidence, which she understood and didn't take personally. The pier was dark when they arrived. That specific harbor darkness that came from the combination of distance from the city's main light pollution and the particular quality of fog that formed over water on cold November nights, settling into the spaces between the industrial structures and making the whole waterfront feel provisional, like it might not be there when the fog cleared. The cold storage facility was a long, low structure of corrugated steel and concrete block, perhaps 300 feet along the water's edge, with two visible vehicle access points and what appeared to be a single pedestrian entrance on the landward side. 3 vehicles were parked against the building's southern wall, none of them trying to be inconspicuous. Why would they be? Nobody came to this pier at 4 in the morning, nobody who wasn't already part of whatever was happening here. Damien studied the building for 30 seconds through a compact optical device. Then he lowered it and turned to Reeves and Carver and delivered a set of instructions she could follow the structure of without understanding all the specifics. 2 points of entry, sequential timing, communications protocol, abort trigger, professional and clipped and fast. He turned to her last. You stay in the vehicle until Reeves signals the east entrance is clear, he said. Then you move to the secondary access point on the north side. There's a ventilation access panel at ground level, industrial size, unlatched according to the building schematic. You go in, you move to the interior partition wall, you find a position where you can observe the main floor without being on it. He held her eyes. You do not engage. You observe and you communicate what you see through this. He pressed a compact earpiece into her hand. That's all. What if? That's all, he said. This is not negotiable. She put the earpiece in. The next 20 minutes were the longest of her life, which was a crowded category given the preceding several hours. She sat in the vehicle and listened to the earpiece and heard nothing for the first 4 minutes except ambient sound. Wind off the water, the distant mechanical groan of something large moving in the harbor. Then Reeves's voice, tight and technical, reporting the east entrance clear. Then Carver, the north approach. Then Damien, simply, moving. She got out of the vehicle. The cold hit her immediately and fully. The November harbor air finding every gap in the clothing she'd been given, and her ankle reported its ongoing objection to the entire situation with a specific insistence she pushed down and kept pushing. She moved along the building's north face with her hand on the corrugated steel for balance, the surface wet and cold beneath her palm, her breath visible in the dark. The ventilation panel was where the schematic said it would be, unlatched, as promised. She pulled it open, and the smell that came out was cold storage, the deep, specific cold of a space that had spent decades chilling things, still present even though the active refrigeration had clearly been offline for years. She went in on her hands and knees, one leg dragging, and came up inside a corridor of exposed industrial infrastructure, pipes and conduit, and the skeletal steel of the building's internal framework. Through the gaps in the partition wall ahead of her, she could see light, the orange-white of industrial work lamps recently set up, and voices, 2 of them, not trying to be quiet. She moved to the partition and found a gap between 2 sections of corrugated panel and pressed her eye to it. The main floor was perhaps 80 feet wide and longer than she could see from her position. In the portion she could see, 4 men were stationed at intervals, armed, attentive, not the relaxed body language of people waiting out a quiet night, but the alert posture of people expecting something to happen, and soon. At the far end of the visible space, beneath one of the work lamps, a folding chair. And in the folding chair, arms secured behind her, blindfolded, wearing what appeared to be a school sweatshirt, a girl, 16 years old, slight, dark-haired, sitting with the particular stillness of someone who had been frightened past the acute stage into the exhausted, endurance stage, the stage where you stopped fighting what you couldn't fight and simply waited for whatever came next. Brielle pressed her back against the partition and breathed through her nose. She was calculating exits, not hers, the girls. The 4 armed men, their positions, their sight lines, the distance between Elena's chair and the closest internal door. She was doing it automatically, the same way she had calculated exits in the ballroom 8 hours ago, the same way she had been calculating exits in rooms since she was 12 years old, and the room she was in started being rooms where knowing the exits mattered. She pressed the earpiece. "I have eyes on her," she said, as quietly as she could make it. "One room, far east end of the main floor. 4 guards. She appears unharmed." Damien's voice came back immediately. "Position of guards." She gave him the positions. "Distance from the east entrance to the target?" 60 feet, maybe 65. A pause that lasted less than 3 seconds. "Stay where you are. Do not move until I tell you." She stayed. The next 4 minutes stretched in a way that minutes did not normally stretch. She kept her eye at the gap and watched the 4 guards and watched Elena in the chair and counted the guards' movement cycles and noted the one on the south side who was checking his phone and the one near the door who had the rigid posture of someone managing fear with performance of nonchalance, and the 2 in the center who were the ones to worry about. Then the east door came off its hinges. Not a slow breach, not a careful entry. The door came off its hinges because something large and fast and deliberate had applied itself to it from the outside, and what came through it was Damien and Reeves in the first second, and Carver 2 seconds behind them, and the room went from silence to complete chaos in the span between one heartbeat and the next. She pressed against the partition and watched through the gap, and did what she'd been told to do, which was observe, and what she observed was controlled and professional and very fast. The 4 guards processed in sequence, non-lethal where possible, not possible in 2 cases, the work lamps swaying from the percussion of the room's sudden transformation, Elena in the chair screaming once at the noise, and then going still when a voice she would have recognized from any room said her name. Damien reached his daughter in 8 seconds from the door breach. Brielle watched him pull the blindfold and cut the restraints and put his arms around the girl. And Elena, who had been holding herself rigid with the terrified discipline of someone refusing to come apart, came apart entirely in the space of approximately 1 second, and the sound she made was the specific sound of a person who has been frightened past what they could manage alone and has just found the one place in the world where they didn't have to manage it anymore. Brielle looked away from the gap. She pressed her back against the cold steel of the partition and sat on the concrete floor with her fractured ankle extended in front of her, and looked up at the pipes and conduit above her and breathed. The earpiece crackled. Damien's voice. "Brielle, where are you?" "North partition," she said. "I'm fine." A pause. "We're coming to you." "Take your time," she said. She meant it. She wanted him to take his time. She wanted him to have 5 uninterrupted minutes with his daughter in a cleared room before anything else required his attention. She wanted those 5 minutes to exist in their complete form without her presence as a complication. She sat on the cold concrete and held her own hands together and noticed they were shaking and let them shake because there was nobody watching and because she had been through enough in the last 8 hours that her hands had earned it. The shaking stopped eventually. Footsteps approached from the main floor, coming around the partition's edge. She looked up. Damien came around the corner first, and behind him, close enough to be touching his arm with one hand the way people held onto things when they needed to confirm the thing was real, came Elena. The girl was perhaps 2 inches shorter than Brielle and had Damien's eyes, that same particular pale clarity. And she had clearly been crying and was not crying anymore, was in the specific post-crisis state of someone who had used everything they had and was now running on the fumes of it. Elena looked at Brielle on the floor. Damien looked at Brielle on the floor. "Your ankle," he said. "Still attached," she said. He reached down and pulled her upright with one hand and kept hold of it for a moment after she was standing. And the keeping hold of it was not a support gesture. She was steady enough. But something else that neither of them named. Elena was looking at her with Damien's eyes. "You're the one who was in the vault," the girl said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "He told me on the way in that there was someone who helped him in the vault." "Your father did most of the work," Brielle said. Elena looked at her for a moment longer. Then she looked at her father. "I want to go home," she said. "I know," Damien said. "Mom doesn't know what happened. She will in about 20 minutes. He put his hand on the back of her head briefly. A gesture so unguarded and so completely different from every version of him Brielle had observed tonight that she felt she was seeing something private and looked away. "I'll call her from the vehicle. Let's move." They moved. Outside, the harbor fog had thickened, swallowing the pier lights and turning everything beyond 30 feet into gray suggestion. The vehicles were where they'd been left. Carver was already on a call. Reeves was doing a perimeter check with the focused attention of someone who understood the perimeter was still a perimeter, regardless of what had just been resolved inside it. Elena got into the back of the primary vehicle. Damien stood by the door for a moment and looked at Brielle standing 3 feet away in the cold, the fog settling on both of them, the harbor invisible and present behind the gray. "The text message on the handset," she said. "When you showed it to me? 4 words." "Yes." "You showed it to me," she said. "You didn't have to do that." He looked at her. "I've been showing you things all night," he said. She didn't have an answer for that was simple enough to say out loud, so she didn't say anything, and the fog moved between them and settled and held. "Get in the vehicle," he said. "You need a real orthopedist." "Yes," she agreed. "I do." She got in the vehicle. The door closed. Through the window, she watched the pier recede, the cold storage facility going gray in the fog, the harbor invisible behind it, the whole night compressing into the rear view. Her ankle was a specific and insistent problem. Her hands were still unsteady. Her body had approximately 4 hours left in it before the deferred impact of everything it had absorbed tonight arrived and made negotiation impossible. But she was in the vehicle. She was moving. And somewhere in the dark ahead of them, the man who had carried her through fire was already on the phone to the mother of his daughter, saying words she couldn't hear, doing the oldest and most difficult thing a person could do, explaining to someone you loved what the world you'd built had cost. The orthopedist was a small, precise woman named Dr. Yuan, who operated out of a private clinic in Midtown that did not appear in any public directory, and whose waiting room contained no magazines because nobody who came here was waiting long enough to need them. She reset and resplinted Brielle's ankle at 5:40 in the morning with the brisk, unapologetic efficiency of someone who had been doing difficult work at inconvenient hours for a long time and had stopped requiring acknowledgement for it. "You walked on this," Dr. Yuan said. It wasn't a question. "A few times," Brielle said. "How many times?" "Several." Dr. Yuan looked at her over the edge of her glasses with an expression that communicated her opinion of this without requiring words. She finished the splint, administered a nerve block that reduced the ankle to a specific and merciful numbness, and told Brielle she had a 4 to 6 week recovery window, provided she stopped treating the injury as optional. Brielle said she would try. Dr. Yuan looked at her again with the same expression. Damien was in the corridor when she came out, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his phone in one hand, and he looked like a man who had been awake for 24 hours and had decided not to negotiate with that fact. The cut above his eyebrow had been properly closed, somewhere between the pier and here. 3 small sutures, neat and minimal. The dark circles beneath his eyes were new or newly visible, and there was a quality to his stillness now that was different from the chosen stillness of earlier. This was the stillness of a man running his reserves and aware of it. Elena was 2 rooms down, sedated lightly. Her mother, a composed woman named Rachel, who had arrived 30 minutes before them, and greeted Damien with an expression that contained 14 years of complicated history in a single look, sitting in the chair beside the bed, holding the girl's hand with the ferocious calm of someone who has been frightened beyond their capacity and is now converting that energy into presence. Damien had spoken to Rachel for 4 minutes in the corridor, his voice too low for Brielle to hear. Rachel had listened without interrupting, which Brielle suspected was not her default mode, and at the end of it she had looked at Damien with an expression that wasn't forgiveness or accusation, but something in between. The expression of someone who had long ago accepted that the situation was what it was and had stopped expecting it to be anything else. He'd come out of that conversation and stood in the corridor for a moment, just breathing, and Brielle had given him that moment because it was his. Now he looked at her coming out of the treatment room and said, "How bad?" "Manageable," she said. "What's happening?" He straightened off the wall. Something had changed in the hour she'd been with Dr. Yuan. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the specific way he was holding the phone. Not worse, exactly. More resolved. The particular quality of a man who has moved through the worst thing and come out the other side into the territory of decisions. "Marco Castellano," he said, "made a call 40 minutes ago to one of the 3 federal contacts we have under long-term documentation. A contact who has been cooperating with my organization, providing information, running interference on certain investigations, for 9 years. He turned the phone toward her, showing her a transcript on the screen. Marco told him the Viscari operation had been dismantled overnight, told him the vault had been secured by Castellano assets, told him the documentation, all of it, 14 years of evidence, was in the process of being transferred. She read the transcript. He thinks he has the vault, she said. Victor told him they had the vault. He put the phone away. Victor told him a great many things over the past 3 months, including that once the transfer was complete, the documentation would be destroyed. He looked at her. 14 years of evidence. Evidence of what this city's power structure has actually been doing while pretending to govern it. Marco's plan was never just to take the shipping network. The shipping network was the profit. The documentation was the prize. Destroy it, and every person I've been holding in check for a decade becomes free. And they move against you immediately, she said. They move against everyone who's ever been caught by it. He started walking, and she moved beside him. Every investigation that was opened because I applied pressure. Every prosecution that proceeded because I removed the interference. Every official who is currently managing their conduct because they know what I have. The moment that documentation is gone, the calculation changes entirely. They reached the corridor's end, and he pushed through a heavy fire door into a stairwell. Victor told Marco the vault was secured, she said. But Victor's been in our custody for the past 3 hours. Yes. He started down the stairs. Which means Marco is operating on information that's 3 hours out of date. He believes he's in the completion phase of a plan that actually failed in its first hour. He looked at her over his shoulder as they descended. That's a window. How wide? Narrow. He reached the bottom level, pushed through into an underground parking bay. The second armored SUV was there, Reeves behind the wheel, Carver in the passenger seat. Both of them looked like they'd been running since midnight and had accepted that as the new standard. Marco is moving the summit meeting. He had a consolidation gathering planned for tomorrow night, all the major Castellano affiliates together in one room to divide the operational territory they believed they were inheriting. He's moved it up, tonight, because he thinks everything is already done. Brielle stopped beside the vehicle. You want to let him finish the gathering, she said. Let everyone arrive, then hit the room. Damien looked at her. One location, she said. Everyone present. Every decision-maker in the Castellano network in the same physical space at the same time because they believe they've already won. Yes, he said. How many people? How many? Between 14 and 20, depending on which affiliates confirm. He opened the vehicle door. Plus whatever security they bring, in a controlled space of their choosing. A pause. It's not a favorable tactical environment, but it's the only time they'll all be in one place. It's the only time they'll ever be in one place, he said. After tonight, if we don't close this, they disperse. The network fragments into components that are individually much harder to reach. The documentation advantage disappears the moment Marco realizes he doesn't have the vault and adjusts his strategy. He looked at her directly. Tonight is the only version of this that ends it. She got in the vehicle. The gathering was at the converted industrial event space in Red Hook, the kind of building that had been a warehouse, then an arts venue, then a private event location that rented exclusively through referral and did not list a public address. 6 stories of exposed brick and steel on the waterfront, accessible from the street through a single fortified entrance and from the water through a private dock that was invisible from the road. Marco Castellano had used it twice before for private events, which was how it appeared in Damien's documentation, and he had chosen it tonight because he believed he was celebrating. They had 4 hours. Damien spent those 4 hours in the back of the SUV with a laptop and the hardline communication system and a series of calls that Brielle sat through without interrupting, watching him reconstruct in real time the operational capacity of an organization that had spent the night being systematically dismantled. He called people she had no reference for in conversations she could follow the architecture of without understanding the specifics, resources being repositioned, personnel being verified, entry points being assessed. He did it with the focused, tireless precision of a man for whom this was not crisis management but simply management, the ordinary work of controlling complex systems under pressure. At one point, somewhere over the bridge, he looked up from the laptop and found her watching him and didn't look away. You should sleep, he said. So should you. I don't sleep before operations. Is that a rule or a medical condition? The corner of his mouth moved. Habit. Bad habit. I have several. He looked back at the laptop. The nerve block on your ankle is going to wear off in approximately 2 hours. I know. When it does, I'll manage, she said. He looked at her again. You say that a great deal. Because it's generally true. It's generally a way of ending conversations about whether you're all right, he said. Not unkindly, with the specific precision of someone who had been paying attention. Those are different things. She looked at him for a moment. I'm not all right, she said. I'm functional. There's a difference, and I know the difference, and right now functional is what's required, so that's what I'm being. I can be not all right later. He held her gaze. Yes, he said quietly. You can. Red Hook arrived gray and cold under a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to produce more rain or simply maintain its current posture of threat. The building was visible 2 blocks out, 6 stories of dark brick, loading dock doors on the ground level closed and locked, lights in the upper floors, a perimeter of vehicles on the surrounding streets that were trying to look parked and were trying too hard. Damien had 12 people, Reeves and Carver, plus 10 others who had materialized over the preceding 4 hours from whatever dispersed positions they'd been maintaining and had arrived at the staging point, a parking structure 1 block west, with the convergent efficiency of people responding to a signal they had been waiting for. They were not an army. They were something more economical than an army. A precisely organized group of people who were very good at specific things and who trusted the person giving them instructions because that person had not been wrong in the ways that mattered. Damien briefed them in the parking structure's lower level, standing in front of a projected schematic of the building pulled from documentation that turned out to include contractor renovation files from 4 years prior. 3 entry points. Overlapping fields of coverage. The summit gathering would be on the 4th floor. The event space's primary room, with a bar setup and seating for 30 and sight lines to both internal stairwells. We go in at the point of maximum density, he said, when the room is settled and the meeting has been called to order. Marco will speak first. He always speaks first. We wait for the room to be seated and focused forward. Entry team through the service stair on the north side, secondary through the freight elevator shaft. Reeves takes the dock approach with water team. 3-point simultaneous. 30-second window from first breach to full room control. The team absorbed this without visible reaction. Questions were brief, technical, answered. He turned to Brielle at the edge of the group. You're not going in, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her as though he'd expected an argument and was recalibrating. Communications, she said. I ran your communications at the pier and it worked. Put me on the channel. I'll monitor the external perimeter and the police band. If Marco has contacts in the department who respond to a noise complaint or a triggered alarm, you need 60 seconds warning minimum. Reeves glanced at Damien. Damien looked at Brielle for a moment. Parking structure roof, he said. You have line of sight to 3 approach vectors from up there. Carver sets you up with the scanner and you stay on channel. He held her gaze. You do not leave that roof. I won't leave the roof, she said. I mean it. I understand that you mean it. He looked at her for 1 more second. Then he turned back to the team. The next 40 minutes were the particular specific hell of waiting with full knowledge of what was coming. Brielle sat on the parking structure roof with a compact radio scanner and an earpiece and a view of the surrounding streets and the harbor beyond the building, the cold working its way through her jacket with patient thoroughness. Her ankle a warm and consistent presence in the middle distance of her nervous system where the nerve block was performing its final hours of service. She watched cars arrive at the building's entrance. Black vehicles, dark glass, the specific anonymous luxury of people who wanted to travel without being identified. She counted them into the scanner log. 14 vehicles total over 22 minutes, which suggested between 14 and 28 occupants depending on load, which tracked with what Damien had said. The last vehicle arrived at 9:47. She pressed the earpiece. Last vehicle just cleared the entrance. 14 total confirmed. Damien's voice came back. Understood. Team positions? Reeves confirmed north stair. Carver confirmed freight approach. The water team confirmed dock position. A pause of perhaps 10 seconds. long enough that she found herself counting her own pulse, which was doing something elevated and unhelpful. Long enough to understand why Damien said he didn't sleep before operations, because the interval between the decision and the action was its own specific category of awful. Then, move. What happened in the next 4 minutes came to her in fragments through the earpiece. Not a clean narrative, but the raw, chopped audio of people moving fast through a high-stakes environment, breathing hard, communicating in the compressed shorthand of trained personnel executing a plan at speed. A door breach. A reported contact on the stairwell landing, resolved in seconds. Reeves saying dock is clear and then immediately we have a problem at the dock, stand by. A sound she couldn't identify. Carver saying freight shaft is compromised, taking the window approach, 30 seconds. Then a sound she could identify through the earpiece and through the cold air of the roof simultaneously. The flat percussive report of gunfire from inside the building, muffled by 6 stories of brick but present, and her body processed it as a full physical event, her hands tightening on the scanner, her breathing going shallow and deliberate. She watched the building's exterior, movement on the ground level, the loading dock doors moving. She pressed the earpiece. Loading dock doors are opening, ground level, east side. A burst of static. Then Damien's voice, strained in a way she had not heard it be strained before. Say again. Loading dock, east side. The doors are opening from inside. Someone's trying to move a vehicle out. 2 seconds of silence that felt like 20. That's Marco, Damien said. He's running. She was already moving. Not consciously, or rather consciously but faster than the conscious decision could be articulated. The decision made somewhere below language in the part of the brain that had been calculating exits in rooms since South Newark, since 12 years old, since the first time the world had made clear that waiting for someone else to solve the problem was not always an available option. She was down the parking structure's internal stairwell in 45 seconds, which cost her the ankle, and she paid it without negotiating, and she came out on the street level and turned east and moved along the building's exterior toward the loading dock with the cold air hitting her face and her pulse doing something that was beyond counting. The dock doors were fully open by the time she reached the corner. A black SUV was already rolling out of the dock bay, moving slowly because the approach ramp forced it to. The vehicle heavy and dark-windowed and emanating the particular purposeful urgency of a driver who wanted to be faster than physics was currently permitting. She was standing directly in the vehicle's path. She understood this as she was doing it. She did it anyway. The SUV stopped. It stopped because it had to stop, because the alternative was running her over in view of the building's exterior cameras and on a street that, while quiet, was not empty. And Marco Castellano was many things, but he was not, at the moment of his attempted escape, in the position of someone who could afford additional complications. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the front passenger window came down. The man who looked at her from the passenger seat was perhaps 60, heavy through the shoulders, silver-haired, wearing the specific expression of someone who has spent decades in rooms where people were afraid of him and is currently recalibrating the experience of being afraid himself. He had the eyes of someone who had been at the top of a violent hierarchy long enough that surprise had become almost physically unfamiliar, and what was in those eyes right now was the disoriented look of a man encountering something his model of the world had not predicted. A woman with a fractured ankle standing in the path of his vehicle at 10 o'clock on a November night. "Move," he said. "No," she said. She said it the way she had said things tonight that she hadn't known she was capable of saying. Not with performance, not with the projected confidence of someone pretending to be less frightened than they were, but with the flat, undecorated certainty of someone who had decided. Marco Castellano looked at her through the window. "Do you have any idea?" "Yes," she said. The words shut him up. She could hear footsteps behind her from inside the building. She could hear voices on the earpiece, but couldn't parse them individually. She kept her eyes on Marco and did not look away because she understood, from every room she had ever been in where looking away had cost her something, that looking away right now would cost her everything. "Get out of the vehicle," she said. A pause that lasted long enough for her to feel her ankle informing her of its full situation, and her hands informing her of their tremor, and her lungs informing her that she had been operating on insufficient oxygen for the past 3 minutes, and all of that information arriving at once and being noted and set aside because none of it changed what she was doing. "You're nobody," Marco said. The words came out with less force than they were meant to have. "You understand that? You're nobody in all of this. Then you've got nothing to worry about," she said. "Get out of the vehicle." Footsteps arrived behind her. She didn't turn. She heard Damien's breathing first. She recognized it, the specific controlled rhythm of it. And then his hand on her shoulder, not pulling her back but present. A contact that said, "I'm here," without requiring her to stop being where she was. Marco Castellano looked past her at Damien. Something moved across the older man's face. A complex, involuntary thing, the specific expression of a man who has played a long game and has arrived at the end of it and is in the process of understanding that the end does not look the way he designed it to. "It's over, Marco," Damien said. Marco looked at him for a long moment. Then his eyes moved back to Brielle, standing in the cold between him and the open road, with nothing in her hands and nothing to recommend her presence there except the fact that she had decided to be there and had not moved. Something shifted in Marco's face. Not surrender. Something before surrender. The specific moment when the calculation finishes running and the result comes back, and the result is not what you planned. Marco Castellano got out of the vehicle. He did it slowly, with the specific deliberateness of a man managing the optics of a surrender he had not planned for and could not afford to perform badly. The door opened and he stepped down onto the dock approach ramp and straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and adjusted the lapel of his jacket with a gesture that was entirely habitual and entirely unconscious. The reflex of a man who had spent 60 years making sure he looked like the most important person in any room he entered, including the rooms where everything had gone wrong. He was flanked immediately by two of Damien's people, who materialized from the dock entrance with the quiet efficiency of a process that had been choreographed in advance. Marco did not look at them. He looked at Damien, and then he looked at Brielle. And the look he gave her was not the look he'd given her through the vehicle window, not the dismissive assessment of someone cataloging a non-threat. This one had something different in it, not respect exactly. The involuntary acknowledgement that his model of the situation had contained an error, and that the error had a face, and that the face was hers. She stepped out of the road. Her ankle accepted this information and transmitted it upward through her nervous system with the full force of its opinion. She kept her face even. She had gotten good at that tonight. Inside the building, the situation on the 4th floor was already resolved by the time Damien's radio confirmed it. 14 Castellano affiliates and their security, secured, the room controlled, no fatalities on Damien's side and 2 on the Castellano side that had been unavoidable and were not going to be unpacked in the cold air of a Red Hook loading dock at 10 in the evening. Reeves's voice came through the earpiece with the clipped completeness of someone filing a report. Room clear, affiliates detained, Marco's second-in-command, a man named Doucet, who had apparently attempted to access a fire escape with a briefcase, in custody on the 3rd floor landing. The briefcase, Reeves noted, contained a portable hard drive and what appeared to be a partial copy of documents from Damien's archive. Victor Kane had talked then. At some point in the hours Brielle had been in the vehicle or in Dr. Ewan's clinic, Kane had provided enough information about the vault's contents for Marco to have begun an extraction process, which meant the window Damien had identified, the window where Marco believed he already had everything, had been even narrower than they'd calculated. Another few hours, and the partial copy would have been enough to begin the unraveling. She thought about that on the drive back to the underground facility, and didn't say it out loud because it was the kind of thought that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The next 6 hours were the organized aftermath of catastrophic events, the particular exhausting work of what happened after the acute crisis ended, and the structural consequences had to be managed. Damien worked through it with the same focused continuity he'd applied to everything else that night, moving between the communications terminal and a series of in-person conversations with people she didn't know in rooms she wasn't in, building the architecture of what came next out of the rubble of what had just collapsed. Brielle sat in the medical room with her ankle elevated and a cup of coffee that someone had produced without being asked, and drank it slowly, and let her body begin to process the accumulated debt of the night. The nerve block had fully expired somewhere around 11. She managed that. At 2 in the morning, a woman she hadn't met before arrived in the medical room and introduced herself as Lena, and she turned out to be the person in Damien's organization responsible for the kind of logistics that didn't appear in any official record. Relocation, documentation, the practical details of making people safe in ways that didn't involve law enforcement. Lena sat across from Brielle with a tablet in a direct manner and explained, without preamble, that Damien had authorized her to offer a complete identity restructuring package, new documentation, relocation to a city of Brielle's choice, and a financial settlement that would make the data entry job and the catering shifts permanently unnecessary. Brielle listened to all of it. Then she said, "Tell him I'll think about it." Lena looked at her. "He said you'd say that," Lena said. "What did he say after that?" "He said to tell you the offer doesn't expire." Brielle nodded. Lena left. She finished the coffee and looked at the ceiling of the medical room. Concrete, utilitarian, the same concrete that was everywhere in this facility, and thought about Newark and the data entry job and the catering van and the 60 seconds she had needed in a library and what those 60 seconds had cost and what they had returned and whether those two things were even in the same category of accounting. She was still thinking about it when Damien came in at 2:30. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely tired. Not the managed tiredness of a man running on discipline. The real kind. The kind that had gotten past the architecture of control and was simply present on his face. He sat in the chair across from the bed without his jacket, without the holster, in the plain dark shirt that made him look less like what he was and more like a man who had been awake for 30 hours and was sitting in a chair because standing had become optional. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "Victor?" she said. "In custody. Federal transfer in the morning. Not our federal contact. A different channel. One he didn't know about." His voice was even, but carried the specific flatness of someone discussing something that had cost them more than the words could hold. "He'll be processed. It'll be quiet. He won't be in a position to cause further damage." "And Marco?" "Same channel. The evidence package we're providing makes the case self-contained. The affiliates who were in that room tonight have a choice to make about cooperation, and most of them will make it the same direction. The federal contact Marco called, the one who's been running interference for 9 years. Resigned at midnight." He looked at his hands briefly, citing personal reasons. She almost asked what that meant. She didn't, because she understood that the specific mechanics of how people with 14 years of documented leverage against them arrived at the decision to resign were not something she needed in detail. "Elena," she said. The tiredness on his face shifted into something that was not exactly softer, but more exposed. The difference between a wall and what was behind it. "Home," he said. "With Rachel. I spoke to her an hour ago." He paused. "She's angry. She has the right to be. She's been angry for 16 years about different versions of the same thing, and she's not wrong about any of it." He said it without self-pity, as a factual inventory. She's 16. She's been frightened, and she'll carry tonight for a long time, but she's home. She's not hurt." His jaw tightened once. "That's the only column that matters tonight." "Is it?" He looked at her. "You almost lost her," Brielle said. Not to punish him, because it was true, and because she thought he needed someone to say it plainly rather than carefully. "Not almost. You came very close to a version of tonight that ended differently. And the reason it didn't end differently has something to do with your people and something to do with luck, and some of it is things you controlled and some of it is things you didn't." "I know that," he said. "I'm not sure you've finished knowing it yet," she said. "I think right now you're in the part where you're managing the consequences and the knowing it is something you've scheduled for later." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not wrong," he said finally. "You can be angry about me saying it." "I'm not angry." "You look a little angry." "I look tired." The corner of his mouth moved. "There's a resemblance." She looked at him across the space of the medical room. The institutional lights, the concrete ceiling, the accumulated hours of the night sitting between them like physical weight, and said what she'd been deciding whether to say for the past hour. "Lena came to see me." "I know. The offer is generous." "Yes." "You don't have to do that," she said. "The relocation, the documentation, I don't need to disappear. You're now known to the people I deal with," he said. "That carries risk. The offer isn't charity." "I know what it isn't." She held his gaze. "I'm saying I don't want to disappear. I've been disappearing my whole life. I'm done with that. Something in his face shifted. That's not a small thing to say, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of something being understood rather than something being avoided. Two people sitting with a truth that was too large for quick resolution and had the patience to wait for the slower work. What do you want? He said. The question was direct and without ornamentation, the way he asked everything. Not what you're willing to accept. Not what makes sense given the circumstances. What do you actually want? She thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. I want to go home, she said, to my apartment in Kearney. I want to sleep in my own bed. I want to be somewhere that has my handwriting on things and my dishes in the cabinet and smells like the candle I burn on weekends. She paused. And after that, I want to figure out what the rest of this is, on ground I can feel under my feet. He nodded slowly. Your apartment is secure, he said. I had it assessed 3 hours ago. She stared at him. You had my apartment assessed? Yes, without asking me. You were unconscious for part of that time. I was awake for most of it. You were managing a fractured ankle and a possible concussion, and I made a security decision on your behalf that I should have consulted you about. He said it evenly and without evasion. I'm aware of that. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. He blinked. Fractionally. For the security assessment, she said, not the method, but the intention behind it. Something in his face settled. Not relaxed. Settled. The specific quality of a man who had braced for an argument he deserved and had received instead something more complicated and more difficult to navigate, which was honesty without punishment. I'll have someone drive you, he said. I can take a car service. Brielle. I know, she said. I know you'll have someone drive me. I'm stating my preference for the record even though I know how it's going to resolve. He looked at her. You do that a lot, he said. Do what? State your preference for the record when you've already accepted the outcome. He studied her face. Why? She thought about it. Because the preference matters, she said. Even if the outcome doesn't change, it matters that somebody knows what I actually wanted. He was quiet for a long moment. The facility hummed around them. The servers, the ventilation, the persistent mechanical background of a place built to function without acknowledgement. I know what you wanted, he said. I've known what you wanted since the library. You wanted 60 seconds where nobody looked at you like you were in the wrong room. She felt that land in the specific place where true things landed. And instead you got 12 hours, he said. Of considerably more than that, she said. Yes. Was any of it? She started. Yes, he said, before she finished. All of it. She nodded, once. She let that be enough for tonight. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning that was cold and overcast in the specific way of early December in New Jersey, Brielle Mercer submitted her resignation from the data entry position by email and then sat at her kitchen table for a long time looking at the sent message icon and feeling the particular vertigo of a decision that could not be undated. Her ankle was elevated on the second chair. Dr. Yuen's instructions, printed and taped to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the state of New Jersey, specified elevation and rest and a follow-up appointment she had scheduled for the following week. She had been following the instructions with a diligence that surprised her, the diligence of someone who had decided their body was worth the attention rather than an inconvenience to be managed around. She had not spoken to Damien since the drive home from the facility in the early hours of the morning 4 days ago, when the car had stopped in front of her building and he had walked her to the door, not because she couldn't manage the walk, but because he had done it, and she had let him. And at the door he had looked at her in the gray pre-dawn light and said, very simply, that he would call. He had called, 3 times in 4 days. Not long calls. He was managing the structural aftermath of a criminal network's collapse and a federal cooperation process, and the specific ongoing work of a 16-year-old daughter who needed her father present in a way that her father was in the process of rearranging his life to make possible. The calls were 20 minutes, 30. They covered practical things and then moved, without deliberate transition, into other things. And the other things were where she found herself paying closest attention and saying the least, and listening to the quality of his voice the way you listen to a piece of music you were beginning to understand. On Tuesday afternoon, he arrived at her door, not announced. A knock, and then his face in the doorway when she opened it, and he was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no hardware, the version of himself that wasn't performing anything. And he was holding a paper bag that turned out to contain soup from a Vietnamese place in the city that she had mentioned, in passing, in the second call, as something she ate when she was trying to feel better about things. She looked at the bag. She looked at him. "You remembered that," she said. "You said it was the thing that helped." He held the bag out. "I was in the city. You drove from the city to Kearney to bring me soup. It's not far." "Damien, it's 40 minutes. He looked at her with those pale, steady eyes. "Are you going to let me in?" She let him in. He sat at her kitchen table while she heated the soup, and he looked around the apartment with the observant attention he brought to everything. The handwriting on the papers on the counter, the dishes visible through the open cabinet, the candle on the windowsill above the sink. And he looked at these things the way someone looked at things they had wondered about and were now understanding. "This is yours," he said. "Yes." "It looks like you." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Is that an observation or a compliment?" "Both," he said. "They're not different things." She brought the soup to the table and sat across from him, and they ate without rushing it. And outside the kitchen window, Kearney went about its Tuesday afternoon in the particular unhurried way of places that had never been important to anyone but the people who lived in them, which was its own category of importance. At some point, she said, "Elena." He set his spoon down. "She asked about you," he said. "Yesterday." Brielle looked up. "She said—" He paused, in the way he paused when he was choosing the accurate version rather than the easy one. "She said the woman in the vault looked like someone who'd been told her whole life she was in the wrong place, and that she figured that out because she recognized it, from herself." Brielle was quiet for a moment. "She's 16, she said." "Yes." He looked at her. "She's 16, and she's been navigating the specific experience of being my daughter for her entire life, which has meant a great deal of being in rooms where she was either invisible or too visible, and rarely anything in between." A pause. "She said she thought you understood that." "I do," Brielle said. "I know you do." The afternoon light came through the kitchen window at a low angle. December light, thin and honest, the kind that didn't flatter anything but made everything clear. She looked at Damien Vescari sitting at her kitchen table in Kearney, New Jersey, in civilian clothes, with the soup he had driven 40 minutes to bring her, and thought about the library and the fire and the vault and the pier and the loading dock and the space between the person she had been when she walked into the Blackwood estate and whoever she was sitting here now. "Victor Kane is going to say things in his cooperation process," she said, "about you, about the organization, about the things in the archive." "Yes." "Some of them will be true. Most of them will be true," he said. "The question is what they're true about. The evidence I'm providing in parallel documents the context. It doesn't excuse everything. It explains the architecture, what I built, and why, and what it was preventing." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "I'm not a good man in the way that word is usually used. I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," she said. "You've known since the library." "I've known since the library," she agreed. "I also know that you came through a burning building for a stranger and that you held on to your daughter in a cleared room at a pier in Red Hook, like she was the only thing in the world that was real." She held his gaze. "People are not one thing. I know that better than most." He looked at her for a long moment. "I want to rebuild something," he said. "I've been thinking about what that means for the past 4 days. Not the network, not the operational structure. Something different. The archives, the documentation. There are people who can use it legitimately. Investigative organizations. Legal structures that exist outside the system that's been compromised. I've been holding this material as leverage for 14 years. I think I'm done holding it as leverage." "What would you do with it instead?" "Release it, properly, through the right hands." He met her eyes. "It would cost me the leverage. It would also actually do what I told myself for 14 years it was for." She looked at him. "What changed?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, a small, uncharacteristic gesture of something working through him. "You stood in front of a moving vehicle," he said, "with a fractured ankle. No weapon, no training. No reason that could be called rational. He looked up. And when I asked you why, you said because you'd decided. That's not an answer to my question. It is, he said, because I've been making decisions for 14 years based on leverage and consequence and the architecture of control. And you made a decision based on none of those things. You made it because it was the right thing to do in that moment, and you were the person standing in that moment. He paused. I'd forgotten that was a category of decision that existed. She looked at him across the table in the December light. What do you need from me? She said. Not romantically, practically. The question of someone taking stock. Nothing, he said. That's not why I'm here. Then why are you here? Because I wanted to sit in your kitchen, he said, and see where you live, and bring you soup. The corner of his mouth moved. And because I haven't said thank you properly. You don't have to... Brielle. Her name in his mouth, the way it had been all night, with weight, with attention, without the casual carelessness with which most people use names as sounds rather than address. Let me finish. She stopped. You came through every door I opened last night, he said. Not because I asked you to, because you decided to. And every time you could have stopped, and every time you didn't. He held her gaze. I've been surrounded my entire adult life by people who stayed because of what I had, what I controlled, what I could give them. He paused. You stayed because you decided the person was worth staying for. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, a car passed. Someone's radio. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Don't make me into something simple, she said finally. I was frightened the entire time. I made it up as I went. I had no plan. I know, he said. I'm a data entry person who does catering shifts on weekends. You were, he said. You resigned this morning. She stared at him. I'm not surveilling you, he said. You mentioned you were thinking about it on the second call. The timing seemed consistent. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. It came out of her completely without permission, a real laugh, unguarded and slightly disbelieving, the laugh of someone encountering the specific absurdity of their situation fully for the first time. He watched her laugh with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Open. The specific openness of someone watching something they had not known they were waiting for. She stopped laughing and looked at him, and they were exactly what they were. A man who had spent 14 years building a kingdom of controlled leverage, and a woman who had spent 28 years trying to become invisible, sitting across from each other at a kitchen table in Kearney, New Jersey, on a Tuesday afternoon that had not been planned by either of them. What happens now? She said. Now, he said, you finish recovering. I spend the next several months managing a fairly complex institutional process. Elena goes back to school and hates me for 2 weeks, and then calls me on a Sunday because she does every Sunday. He paused. And at some point, when the ground is settled, I ask you if you want to have dinner somewhere that isn't an underground facility or a kitchen in New Jersey. I like my kitchen, she said. I know, he said. I like it too. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the window, the December afternoon was doing what December afternoons did. Shortening, the light pulling back toward the horizon, the day contracting into something smaller and more essential. She had walked into the Blackwood estate 11 days ago as a woman who had learned to occupy as little space as possible, who had refined the art of disappearing inside rooms full of people who didn't see her, who had believed on some level she could not fully articulate that the smallness was her fault, that she was the problem that needed to be solved, the weight that needed to be reduced, the presence that needed to be apologized for. She had stood in front of a moving vehicle with a fractured ankle. She had swung an IV stand at the oldest friend of the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard. She had stood in a fog-covered loading dock and said no to a man who had not been told no in a very long time. None of it had required her to be different from what she was. None of it had required her to be smaller. It had required exactly what she had always been, in the rooms where nobody had bothered to notice. A woman who looked at exits and calculated distances and paid attention to what everyone else decided wasn't worth watching. A woman who, when the moment came, decided. She reached across the kitchen table and picked up her soup spoon and finished her soup. Damien watched her. He would be there when she was done. She did not rush.